So good to have you join us in this edition of Business Daily. Coming to you live from Seoul, I'm Lee Ji-yoon. Let's get started with a glimpse of today's highlights. A group of ruling Saenuri Party officials have openly demanded that the Bank of Korea adopt more aggressive quantitative easing measures, but others are doubting these would work. We'll sit down with an expert to talk about this. As the country's sugar intake inches up, food manufacturers will soon be required to provide more information about sugar levels on their packaging. These stories and more coming right up. But first, tax revenues are up so far this year. Korea's finance ministry says it has collected some $37.3 billion in taxes over the months of January and February. Compared to the same period last year, that's an increase of $9.5 billion and represents 19% of the year's total tax revenue target. The finance ministry attributed the rise to growth in income and value-added taxes on the back of an improved property market and consumer spending in the fourth quarter. Meanwhile, central government debt remained high at some $504 billion, though deficit spending was seen to be slowing in the first 2 months of the year on year. Korea's export prices dropped for the first time in 4 months in March. Preliminary data from the Bank of Korea indicate that export prices were down 1.5% from the previous month. The central bank attributes the slide to the strengthening Korean won against the U.S. dollar, with the local currency gaining 2.4% against the greenback in March from the month before. Despite a pickup in global oil prices, import prices remained unchanged due to the exchange rate. The price of Dubai crude, Korea's benchmark, rose over 20% on month in March. We're only a day away from Election Day, and to win over the hearts of voters, political parties have put out a series of pledges aimed at boosting the local economy. In fact, the ruling Saenuri Party has called on the Bank of Korea to implement quantitative easing measures, a move that has stirred up controversy over the proposed effectiveness. Let's take a closer look.
Just last month, Kang Bong-kyun, a former finance minister and co-head of the ruling party election committee, proposed that the Bank of Korea buy corporate bonds and mortgage-backed securities to boost the economy. Addressing the need for quantitative easing, the ruling party pointed to how other central banks around the world, including the U.S. Federal Reserve, the Bank of Japan, and the European Central Bank, have employed such measures. But under current laws, Korea's central bank can only buy or sell government bonds, meaning in order for such purchases to take place, certain amendments would be inevitable. The BOK has remained cautious on this proposal, saying that Korea's economic growth and inflation rates are different from advanced countries, and that hasty decisions could bring about side effects. Despite the growing controversy over all this, the ruling party plans to submit a bill to revise the law after the new parliament is sworn in following the April general elections.
And to tell us more about this, Professor Yang Jun-seok from the Catholic University of Korea joins us in the studio today. So good to see you, Professor.
Happy to be here.
All right, so let's talk about quantitative easing. When did monetary officials decide to use QE, and what countries have implemented such measures?
Okay, well, when central banks want to control their money supply or their interest rates, they use short-term government bonds, which are the safest bonds available. Now, the problem with that is that it only directly affects the short-term government interest rate. It only affects the private lending rate and the long-term rates indirectly. Now, what QE does is it allows the central banks to buy the longer-term bonds and private bonds directly, so they can affect those interest rates more directly. Now, usually when you're using QE, you're at zero rate bound, which is when the government bond rates go down to 0%. And they want to lower the other rates further, but they cannot do it directly through the government purchase of government bonds. Now, United States has used it, the United Kingdom has used it, though they finished their QE programs now. Japan and EU are currently using it. And an interesting case is China, which some people refer to as QE.
Okay.
But technically, I don't think it is correct to use that term. What China is doing is they're printing a lot of money, but then they're channeling it into various government projects that they like, and buying bonds which are issued from those particular projects.
All right, then. Now, the ruling Saenuri Party, that is, has proposed to Korea to adopt quantitative easing like many advanced countries that you just mentioned. So, can you tell us more about this?
Okay, well, what Saenuri Party wants to do is they want to try quantitative easing. Instead of buying government short-term bonds, they want to buy the bonds of Korea Development Bank, which is carrying some workouts for some of the largest chaebols which are in trouble. For example, Daewoo Shipbuilding and STX. And then they also want the Bank of Korea to purchase real estate apartment mortgage-backed securities. So they want to go further and buy these bonds directly.
But then by the law, the Bank of Korea can't buy or sell corporate bonds or even other mortgage-backed securities, meaning in order for this quantitative easing to be introduced, there would need to be legislative revisions, right?
Right. Under the current Bank of Korea law, they can only buy bonds which are backed by government. So what Saenuri Party says they will do is during the first day of the new National Assembly, they will pass a new Bank of Korea law which allows them to do this.
Oh, all right. So in order for all this to happen, the bill would need to be passed, which means the central bank would need to directly intervene in the financial market. But analysts are saying that such should not happen except only in exceptional cases.
Right. The advanced country examples that we talked about earlier, they've all taken place when the short-term government bond interest rate has gone down to 0%, and Korea right now is at 1.5%. Also, in the advanced countries, what they did is they buy these bonds from the banks, and they don't really target certain types of bonds other than it's a long-term bond or it's a private bond. Now, on the Korean measure, they've targeted two specific types of bonds issued by KDB and mortgage security, mortgage-backed bonds. And that is, I think, closer to the Chinese model than to the advanced country model.
All right, then what's your opinion on this? I mean, do you think the Korean economy is in need of more aggressive monetary policy as well as quantitative easing?
Well, we're at 1.5% rather than 0%. Now, there's some question over whether the interest rate can go lower because, well, Korea is more risky than the United States, so we need some type of a risk premium. But still, 1.5 is pretty high to start engaging in this type of QE.
All right.
Now, another problem is that they're targeting these two specific types of bonds, and there's some question over whether it'll be politically neutral and it'll be most efficient economically. So if I were trying to plan this type of QE, I would try to put in more safeguards so that we can make sure that these bonds are not only going to a specific type of bank, going to help specific types of company, and going to real estate alone, but have a more wider, more objective purchasing of bonds.
Now, talking about that, going along with that, there are also growing controversy over the central bank's independence over all this. So what's the BOK stance at this point?
Okay, well, the BOK, as well as the Blue House and the Ministry of Finance, don't really like this plan that much. They've refrained from saying it, but they've given a lot of signals that they're very reluctant. I think part of the problem is that it only targets those two specific types of bonds that I've talked about. Other advanced countries, they have a much wider range of bonds that they can purchase, so they have more effect on the economy, and there's less chance of funds being channeled to certain types of projects.
And like you mentioned earlier, the ruling Saenuri Party is planning to, I guess, submit a bill regarding this quantitative easing after tomorrow's general election ends. So what kind of process waits ahead in order for this bill to be passed?
Okay, well, usually in Korea, you submit either the government submits the bill or the National Assemblyman submits a bill. Given the position that the Blue House and the Ministry of Finance has taken, I'm not sure if the government will come up with the bill, so it'll probably be submitted by the Saenuri Party, one of the National Assemblymen. Now, given that they've only had They promised that they will implement this law in 100 days. I'm not sure if they can come up with a good quality legislation within that time.
All right. Thank you so much for your insight today, Professor.
Thank you.
A new report has shown that by the year 2030, more than 3 million people here in Seoul will be 60 or over, ranking the Korean capital as the 8th oldest city in the developed world. And our Kim Min-ji tells us that this aging population will have a knock-on effect on spending patterns.
Seoul is on track to becoming one of the fastest aging cities in the world. That's the assessment of the McKinsey Global Institute, which says more than 30% of Seoul's population will be aged 60 or over by 2030, which is roughly 3.2 million people. That's a significant jump considering that the figure stood at 18%, or some 1.8 million people in 2015. The 2030 figure puts Seoul in 8th place among cities in major economies. Topping the list will be Tokyo at 13.2 million, or 35% of its population. Osaka will be second on the list, followed by New York. In fact, this age group is forecast to grow by more than a third in developed countries, from 164 million in 2015 to 222 million in 2030. They are expected to generate more than 50% of urban consumption growth in developed countries. With this shift in demographics, the institute forecasts that the industrial structure will also change. Consumption is shifting to services already, with spending heavily concentrated on healthcare among aging consumers in developed regions and increasing spending by consumers in emerging economies on the back of a rise in their incomes. As for Korea, 34% of consumption goes to the service sector, which ranges from restaurants to education and leisure. For consumption goods such as clothing and food products, the percentage stood at 24%. Kim Min-ji, Business Daily.
Taxing those with the sweet tooth. Britain has become the latest country to introduce a sugar tax on carbonated beverages, following countries like Mexico and France. And Korea has also declared its own battle against sugar, as related costs are posing greater threats by the day. Our Lee Ju-young tells us more.
The not-so-sweet truth. According to the World Health Organization, the number of diabetes patients worldwide has nearly quadrupled over the past 3 decades to reach 422 million, and high blood sugar levels are linked to roughly 3.7 million deaths worldwide each year. So as countries like the UK, Mexico, and France have imposed a sugar tax to halt various chronic illnesses stemming from sugar, the Korean government has also announced measures of its own. The Ministry of Food and Drug Safety has revealed an unprecedented 5-year anti-sugar campaign to reduce people's consumption levels. That means if an adult were to take in roughly 2,000 calories a day, the acceptable amount of sugar should be less than 200 calories, equivalent to about 17 sugar cubes. Citing data from 2013, the Food Ministry said Koreans aged 3 to 29 were found to have exceeded the government's recommended 10% ratio of sugar intake to daily calories. The government says this is an alarming figure, as such individuals are roughly 40% more likely to develop obesity or diabetes and 66% more prone to developing high blood pressure. The medical costs and productivity losses from obesity alone are astronomical, having mounted to nearly $5.9 billion in 2013. Featuring most prominently on the list of sugar-heavy food products that contribute to the problem are carbonated drinks at 31%, followed by pastries, cookies, and rice cakes. This is why the Food Ministry has decided to require food makers to label high-sugar soft drinks as high-calorie, low-nutrition foods by 2018 and gradually expand this to other sugar-heavy products including candies, pastries, and other snacks by 2020. They will also introduce new education programs on nutrition at schools, as well as develop better sugar substitutes. Meanwhile, local beverage and snack producers say they are ramping up efforts to introduce a wider range of low-sugar sweets that can appeal to consumers' tastes, though that is expected to require significant time and effort. Lee Ju-young, Business Daily.
And that does it for today. But we'll be back tomorrow with more business news that matters to you. So don't forget to tune in then. Thanks for watching, and bye-bye for now.